If you are hearing this right now, it is not by accident. You were not randomly scrolling. You were not forgotten. You were not overlooked. You are here because something in you has endured what most people could not survive. Chosen one. There were moments you questioned whether God still saw you. Moments when obedience felt unrewarded. When silence felt louder than any answer. And when walking away would have made more sense than standing still in faith. Yet you stayed. You kept going when there was no applause, no clarity, and no confirmation. That alone separated you. What you didn't realize is that heaven was watching the entire time. Every decision you made when no one else was present. Every time you chose integrity over ease. Every time you trusted God without evidence. These were not delays. These were tests. And now, something has shifted. The final test was never about what you could endure externally. It was about what you would choose internally. Would you still believe when nothing changed? Would you still love God without receiving anything in return? Would you still obey when the outcome was unclear? You passed. What happens next is not what you've been expecting. God's reaction is not silence. It is not hesitation. And it is not disappointment. It is something far more powerful and far more sobering than you imagined. Before this message continues, I need you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel, because these messages are confirmations meant to meet you at precise moments like this. Second, comment, "I am ready" below, not for the algorithm, but as a declaration of alignment. And finally, stay with this message until the very end, because what is revealed later will explain why your hardest season came right before your commissioning. This is not encouragement. This is recognition. And what God is about to do through you will require everything you've already survived. 1. The mark of the chosen. There has always been something different about you, even before you had language for it. You sensed it in rooms where you didn't quite fit, in conversations that felt shallow, and in paths that others seemed comfortable walking while something in you quietly resisted. This wasn't rebellion. It was recognition. The mark of the chosen has never been visible to the crowd. It is felt in the spirit. From the beginning, your life carried a weight that others could not understand. Responsibility came early. Awareness came early. Pain, too, arrived sooner than expected. While others were learning how to belong, you were learning how to endure. While others were forming identities from approval, you were being stripped of everything that could not survive isolation. That was not cruelty. That was preparation. Chosen ones are rarely celebrated in the season of becoming. They are questioned, misunderstood, and often labeled as difficult or distant. People sensed depth in you that made them uncomfortable, conviction that challenged their compromises, and restraint that didn't match the chaos around them. You weren't trying to stand apart, but you were never meant to blend in. God marked you not with ease, but with endurance, not with popularity, but with discernment. You were given eyes that see beneath words and a spirit that feels shifts others dismiss. That sensitivity was never weakness. It was training. You were being taught to recognize truth even when it whispers and danger even when it smiles. This is why comfort was never your portion for long. Just when things felt stable, something would shift. Just when you settled, God would move you again. Relationships ended without explanation. Doors closed without warning. Familiar ground became unfamiliar. It wasn't punishment. It was alignment. Anything that tried to keep you smaller than your calling had to be removed. The mark of the chosen also attracts resistance. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because your presence exposes what others avoid. Some projected their fears onto you. Some resented your restraint. Some tried to diminish you so they wouldn't have to confront themselves. You felt it, even when no one said it out loud. And still, you stayed true. What separated you most was not talent or strength. It was obedience when no one was watching. You walked away from things that would have been easier to stay in. You said no when yes would have brought approval. You waited when rushing would have brought relief. These choices weren't dramatic, but they were decisive. Heaven noticed every one of them. This is the mark few recognize. You survived without becoming bitter. You endured without losing your reverence. You were misunderstood without hardening your heart. That combination is rare. That combination is dangerous to darkness. That combination is why your life could never follow a common pattern. You may not have understood it then, but every delay, every detour, every lonely stretch was shaping authority in you. Not authority over people, but authority in the spirit. The kind that cannot be borrowed, imitated, or taken. The kind that only comes from walking with God when there is nothing to gain. This is why the journey has felt so long. This is why shortcuts were never offered. This is why the cost was high. You weren't just chosen to believe. You were chosen to carry weight. And this was only the beginning. 2. Why the path became heavy. There came a point when the journey stopped feeling merely difficult and began to feel heavy. Not just busy, not just tiring. Heavy in a way that settled into your chest, your thoughts, your prayers. You noticed it when progress slowed, when resistance increased, and when the strength that once carried you seemed to demand more than you had left. This was not weakness. This was weight. The path became heavy because the assignment became clearer in the spirit, even if it was still unclear in the natural. God does not add pressure to crush you. He adds weight to strengthen you. What felt like overload was actually calibration. You were being trained to carry something that would require endurance beyond enthusiasm, and faith beyond emotion. As you moved forward, things you once relied on stopped working. Motivation faded. Support grew inconsistent. Even prayer felt different, less emotional, more intentional. You weren't losing faith. Your faith was being refined. God was shifting you from needing reassurance to embodying trust. That transition is always heavy. This is also when loss began to cluster. Not all at once, but enough to make you question the pattern. People drifted. Opportunities stalled. Plans unraveled. It felt personal, even targeted. But the heaviness wasn't random. God was removing dependencies that would later become liabilities. Anything you leaned on more than Him had to loosen its grip. The path became heavy because you were no longer being treated like a beginner. Early grace makes room for mistakes. Advanced calling requires precision. God began to deal with your motives, not just your actions. Your reactions, not just your choices. The pruning went deeper because the fruit was meant to last longer. You also carried burdens that weren't yours by choice. You felt responsible for others. You absorbed pain in rooms where no one acknowledged it. You interceded silently. You held space emotionally and spiritually, often without thanks. That wasn't accidental. God was training your capacity to stand in gaps others never see. Heaviness also came from delay. Not denial, delay. You could sense movement but not timing. Direction but not details. Vision but not release. This tension stretched you. It taught you how to wait without wasting the weight, how to remain faithful when the promise stayed invisible, how to keep your posture right while everything felt unresolved. There were moments you wondered if you had missed God altogether, if obedience had led you in circles, if choosing the narrow path had cost you more than it was worth. Those questions didn't disqualify you. They proved you were still engaged. Indifference would have been easier. You chose to wrestle instead. The heaviness was also resistance. Darkness recognizes threat before manifestation. You were opposed not for what you had done, but for what you were becoming. Pressure increased because retreat would have been convenient. You were being tested at the point where many turn back, not because they are weak, but because the weight convinces them it's unnecessary. Yet you didn't quit. You adjusted. You slowed when needed. You carried the weight without dropping your faith. And without realizing it, strength was forming beneath the pressure. Not loud strength, quiet strength. The kind that doesn't announce itself but never collapses. The kind that can hold responsibility without ego and authority without arrogance. The path became heavy because you were approaching depth. Surface faith could not survive where you were being led. God was not punishing you, He was preparing you, and the weight you carried then would become the stability you stand on next. 3. The tests. No one saw some of the most defining moments of your life, never had an audience. No witnesses, no applause. No one to validate what you chose when you could have chosen differently. These were the tests no one saw, and they mattered more than any public victory ever could. God was not measuring how you behaved when others were watching. He was watching who you became when you were alone, when temptation was quiet, when compromise would have gone unnoticed, when obedience felt unnecessary because no consequence seemed attached. Those moments revealed your true alignment. There were times you could have spoken and defended yourself, but you stayed silent. Times you could have retaliated, but you chose restraint. Times you could have taken advantage, but you walked away. No one congratulated you for those decisions. In fact, some people misunderstood your silence as weakness. Heaven saw it as strength. You were tested in integrity before you were trusted with influence. Tested in humility before you were entrusted with authority. Tested in patience before you were given direction. These were not random moral moments. They were checkpoints. God was ensuring that when power came, it would not corrupt you. You were also tested in disappointment. Prayers that seemed unanswered. Promises that appeared delayed beyond reason. Opportunities that almost materialized, then vanished. These moments tested whether you loved the outcome more than the one who promised it. You learned how to remain faithful without emotional reward. Some tests came through people. They questioned your intentions, minimized your growth, or treated your loyalty casually. You felt the sting of being overlooked, replaced, or taken for granted. The test wasn't whether you noticed, it was whether you allowed it to poison your heart. You chose to stay clean inside, even when the situation wasn't fair. Other tests came through temptation to settle, to choose what was available instead of what was aligned, to accept almost instead of waiting for appointed. You felt the pressure of time, comparison, and fatigue. Still, you resisted rushing. That restraint was costly, but it preserved your future. There were also tests of faith that looked like boredom. Seasons with no movement, no excitement, no visible progress. Just consistency. Just showing up. Just doing what you were called to do even when it felt insignificant. Many people quit in these seasons. You stayed. That endurance was noted. You were tested in forgiveness when apologies never came, in obedience when explanations never arrived, in trust when God's silence felt personal. Each time you had a choice, harden or soften, retreat or remain, complain or commit. You didn't always feel strong, but you stayed aligned. These tests refined your discernment. You learn to recognize what drains you versus what feeds you, who is assigned to walk with you versus who is only seasonal, when to speak and when to wait. These lessons could not be taught publicly. They had to be learned privately. What makes these tests powerful is that no one can take credit for them. No one can accuse you of performing for approval. Your obedience was not curated. It was real. And because it was real, it shaped you deeply. You may have wondered if any of it mattered. If unseen obedience carried weight. If quiet faith counted. It did. More than you know. Because before God ever tests you with visibility, He tests you with invisibility. Before He entrusts you with much, He watches what you do with little. And before He elevates you publicly, He confirms you privately. You passed tests no one saw. And that is why what comes next cannot be stopped. 4. The final test. The final test did not arrive the way you expected. There was no dramatic announcement, no clear marker to tell you this moment was different from all the others. In fact, it looked ordinary, quiet, almost disappointing. And that is why it was decisive. The final test was not about what you could endure anymore. It was about what you would surrender. God was no longer measuring your strength. He was measuring your trust. Would you still obey without urgency? Would you still believe without emotion? Would you still remain faithful when the journey no longer felt meaningful? This test reached places the others could not. It touched your expectations, your timelines, your understanding of how God should move by now. You had already proven endurance. You had already demonstrated loyalty. Now the question became simpler and harder. Could you let go of control completely? There were moments you felt numb rather than inspired. Prayer felt disciplined instead of passionate. Worship felt quiet instead of powerful. You weren't backsliding. You were being stripped of dependence on feeling. God was teaching you how to stand without adrenaline, how to walk by trust rather than momentum. The final test required obedience without reassurance. No signs, no confirmations, no encouragement from others. Just a steady invitation to keep choosing God without needing proof that anything was about to change. This is where many people disengage, not because they stop believing, but because belief without feedback feels pointless. You may have wondered if you were being forgotten, if heaven had moved on, if all your faith had led to an anticlimax. But what you didn't see was that God was watching for something rare: contentment without fulfillment, faith without reward, love without return. This test also confronted your identity. If nothing ever changed, would you still be who God called you to be? If the promise never manifested, would obedience still define you? God was separating your calling from your outcome, so your faith could no longer be negotiated. You were tempted to force movement, to make something happen just to feel alive again, to compromise timing for relief. That temptation was not sin, it was fatigue speaking, but you resisted. You chose to wait without resentment, to remain without complaint, to trust without leverage. The final test was internal. No one could help you pass it. No advice applied, no strategy worked. It was you and God alone, standing in a space where faith had to mature or collapse. You felt exposed, not to others, but to yourself. And then something subtle happened. You stopped striving. You stopped asking when. You stopped bargaining. You rested, not because you had answers, but because you trusted the one who did. That moment marked the completion of the test. Not when circumstances changed, but when your posture did. God was not waiting for your breakthrough, He was waiting for your surrender. And when it arrived, heaven took note. The final test was never meant to break you. It was meant to free you. Because what comes next cannot be carried by someone still holding conditions. And what God is about to release requires a heart fully yielded. You didn't pass because you were perfect. You passed because you were willing. And that changed everything. 5. Heaven's silence. Explained. After the final test, you expected something, anything, to change. A sign, a shift, a sense of release. Instead, there was silence. Not the kind that feels peaceful, but the kind that forces you to listen to your own breathing, your own thoughts, your own doubts. Heaven seemed quiet at the very moment you thought it would speak. That silence was not absence, it was attention. God did not go silent because He was undecided. He went silent because the testing phase had ended. When heaven is evaluating response, it speaks. When heaven is confirming alignment, it observes. Silence is not withdrawal, it is transition. This is where many misunderstand God. We assume silence means delay or disapproval. In truth, silence often means the decision has already been made. The movement you were waiting for had shifted from preparation to positioning. God was no longer correcting you. He was trusting you. Heaven's silence also revealed what was still stirring inside you. Without guidance, without reassurance, without instruction, what would rise to the surface? Anxiety or peace? Control or surrender? Complaining or confidence? Silence exposes what noise hides, and what surfaced in you surprised even you. You didn't fall apart, you didn't revert, you didn't chase substitutes, you stayed steady. The silence was God allowing you to experience maturity. Not the excitement of being led, but the stability of being aligned. This is the difference between needing God to speak and knowing God has already spoken. You were learning how to move from instruction to embodiment. There were moments you questioned if you should do something, anything, to break the quiet. But deep down, you knew better. You sensed that rushing now would undo what had taken years to build. So you waited, not passively, but reverently. You honored the silence instead of fighting it. Heaven also went silent because announcement was near. God does not always speak before he acts. Sometimes he allows the stillness to stretch so the impact of what comes next cannot be mistaken for coincidence. Silence sharpens perception. It prepares the heart to recognize movement when it arrives. You were also being protected. If God had spoken too soon, you might have shared prematurely, moved impulsively, or misaligned timing. Silence guarded the assignment until you were ready to carry it without dilution or fear. What is sacred is often kept quiet until it is secure. This silence required faith of a higher order. Not faith that God will move, but faith that God has moved, even when nothing looks different. This is where trust becomes instinct rather than effort. You stopped asking for updates because you trusted the outcome. Heaven was watching your response to the quiet. Whether you would fill it with worry or with worship. Whether you would doubt your journey or honor it. Whether you would abandon the path or stand firmly on it. And you stood. The silence did not mean you were being ignored. It meant you were being confirmed. When heaven goes quiet after obedience, it is often because approval does not need commentary. The test was complete. The alignment was verified. The timing was sealed. And what follows silence of this kind is never small. Because when God speaks again, it will not be instruction. It will be release. 6. God's stunning reaction. God's reaction was not what you imagined. You expected relief, permission to rest, maybe even an explanation for why the journey had been so hard. Instead, heaven responded with something far more sobering and far more powerful. Approval, not excitement, not urgency. Approval that had already been decided long before you reached the end of the test. Heaven did not celebrate because you finished. Heaven celebrated because you became someone who could be trusted. What stunned you was not what God said, but what he didn't need to say. There was no correction left, no adjustment required, no warning given. The refining had done its work. What remained was alignment. God's reaction was confidence. He was not surprised by your endurance. He had already seen every choice you would make when the pressure increased. Every moment you would choose restraint over reaction, faith over feeling, obedience over outcome. The test did not inform God. It revealed you. This is where many misunderstand divine response. God does not react emotionally to obedience. He responds strategically. His approval is not applause. It is entrustment. When he is pleased, he releases responsibility. You were not met with a breakthrough first. You were met with authority. In the spirit, something shifted. You may not have felt it physically, but access changed. Doors that once resisted no longer required force. Discernment sharpened, confidence settled. Not loud, not arrogant, but unshakable. This was the mark of approval. God's reaction also stunned you because it came without fanfare. No announcement, no validation from others. Just a quiet knowing that something had been sealed. You realized you were no longer waiting. You were standing in readiness. Heaven did not rush because there was no risk of delay anymore. Timing was no longer fragile. You had proven you would not sabotage the assignment through impatience, pride, or fear. That removed the final barrier. God also entrusted you with weight, not blessing for display, but responsibility for impact. Influence without ego. Authority without dominance. Clarity without urgency. These are signs of divine confidence. What stunned you most was realizing that heaven had been ahead of you the entire time. While you were still questioning, God had already decided. While you were enduring silence, God was arranging alignment. While you were being tested, God was preparing release. The reaction was not well done, now rest. It was well done, now move. Because rest without assignment would have undone you. You were not refined to retreat. You were refined to advance, carefully, purposefully, and under authority. God's reaction was also protection. With approval came covering. With trust came boundaries. You were not being sent exposed, you were being sent established. This is why what comes next will feel different, not easier, but clearer, not louder, but steadier. The confusion lifted not because answers were given, but because confidence was granted. You did not receive everything you asked for. You received what you were ready to carry. And that is the reaction that stuns most people, because God's highest response to obedience is not reward. It is trust. The journey and the commission. Chosen one, now you see the truth. Every trial, every silent test, every moment of heaviness, all of it has brought you to this moment of commissioning. You are not who you were when the journey began. You have been refined, confirmed, and approved. Heaven has watched, and now you carry the authority to move forward with clarity, courage, and purpose. The final test was never meant to break you. It was meant to prepare you. The silence you endured was never emptiness. It was alignment. And God's reaction was never delayed. It was perfect timing to release what you are now equipped to handle. You are not simply moving forward. You are stepping into destiny. Remember this. The weight you carried was not punishment. The trials you faced were not mistakes. The unseen tests were not meaningless. Everything has formed a foundation strong enough to bear what is coming next. You are being sent, not because the world requested it, but because heaven ordained it. You are chosen, approved, and entrusted. Now is the time to walk boldly, to act with authority without arrogance, to lead with faith without compromise, to love with power without fear. The mantle is yours. The assignment is yours. The impact is yours. And heaven stands behind you, celebrating the obedience that brought you here. Do not look back. Do not wait for validation. Move forward with confidence, knowing that the one who tested you is the same one who equips you. Every lesson you have learned, every season of endurance, every moment of quiet has prepared you for this. The path ahead will demand courage, wisdom, and discernment. But you are ready. You are equipped. You are sent. Finally, remember this call to action. Step into your assignment. Declare your readiness. Walk in alignment. And share this message with those who need confirmation that their endurance is seen, their obedience is noted, and their destiny awaits. You passed the final test. Now the journey begins, not as a follower of circumstance, but as a leader of purpose. Heaven has spoken. God has released. And you are chosen. You are ready. You are sent.